222 12.
Yeah, if you give me a JPEG.
Yeah, that's fine. Should we just check the sound while you've got your laptop there?
Yeah.
Put your volume.
Sorry, just gonna say.
Not ringing around with it. Oh no, there's no put it in.
No.
Oh, sure.
I also want to make sure since it's already on the second one,
Oh, we need that on a stick, won't we? That's I'm gonna stick. I'll give more sticks to
Harold. Asher.
actually we're fine. Maybe I should tell them.
Okay.
you sure? I don't mind, it's not a problem. I just need to download that as a JPEG to us when we stick.
Let me check stuff.
222. Two, two, two. So I'm definitely getting the sound output here. Hello, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Can you hear me? 2, 2, 2, 2, 2. 3, 4, 5. 1, 2. You want it louder? We can go louder. Yeah, 1, 2, 3.
So it's delayed.
Right, okay. It's probably going to be delayed.
There's a big delay on the sound.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 2, 2.
Oh, there's a delay from YouTube. Yeah, he said it's always a delay.
Yeah, it's always going to delay.
It's off.
2, 2.
Let's download your. Can we get your stick, mate?
Yeah. Stick you can transfer to.
Yeah.
But then the year before they were quite celebratory. Yes, I think the whole changed financially. So my overriding memory of it was just rain.
Suppose it rained non-stop for 10 days.
Part of the skip last week, isn't it?
Which was that? I didn't. You know what? I didn't go. Nearly nine. So.
Yeah, save yourself there.
But I get old. I get to bed is the most exciting thing I do. Don't drive off. It's there for 2 to 3 days as well. So. Was it a good party?
Yeah, definitely. And then speeches from the candidates.
And they kept to their minutes?
They did.
Yeah, that's good.
They did.
No one wants their drinks interrupted too long.
I mean, the only interruption was that I think Kemi was rather late, so they had to slightly tweak the format.
Oh,
So
yeah.
fine otherwise.
Yeah.
What's your take on this topic?
Well, I'm at Tom 2.5. Oh, this topic.
Oh yeah, but interested on your views on the candidates too, suppose.
I thought I was chairing. So I'm going to ask Sophia to go last because I actually do not know what so,
well, you can do an arbiter of the comments.
well, I may do that actually. Because really, I'm not surprised that afterwards because yeah, I think I would listen to it. Good thanks. Tom 2 last night. Phil.
Smyth?
I think all of them. Tom is balanced. He's less tainted by the past. All of them going up and stuff. He's just a nice guy. Party can do the nice bits. Some of the backbiting that we've had over recent years. Just a calm and pleasant that's my concern about Canada. Lots of politics. She's not so calm.
But it's a good MPs though.
Oh, good.
Whereas I think Tom and Keir might be slightly more dull together.
Some of them.
Probably more what we actually need from our politics.
Yes. But not what we necessarily
not what
want
I
for
want for my dad.
no, not what we want for yeah. So I think the are doing quite well at the moment.
Yeah, it's been good. I mean, the transition's always interesting when the time to
We've lost people to government, I suppose.
couple, yeah, so we lost our eccentric Cass Roberts to the nature role in the Lieutenant. My boss, Rachel Stapleton, went into children in early years, which was interesting. I don't think many externals went into it. They were quite loyal actually to the kind of party as it had been, which they don't have to be. You see it this year. But
Well,
Chris, no. The microphones offer the recording
How are you doing,
of the
Iain?
live stream. That's why.
Okay,
So
right.
speak up. I mean, it should
Projection.
exactly.
Yeah.
Chris, did you
Yeah,
catch that?
no.
The microphones are not.
They had a minute
for
from the
recording.
different
They're not for
sides. It's quite
amplification.
good
They're just
to
for the
talk
recording.
Okay, fine.
So just speak up.
Good humour
It should be
that they-
fine with the side
fine.
screen, but
Good luck.
tapping it and saying, "Is it on?" or not?
Hello. Will not
I've
work.
done now, to be honest with you, this whole
Right.
1 o'clock, and then I'm gonna. I think I've got a meeting, and then I'm gonna go get a drink.
So yes, I'll come to you
It's quite ill last week.
First.
So I
last.
haven't quite recovered because I keep doing stuff
I'll come
along
to
the end.
you
So
first for opening
this
remarks.
was
That's
having
okay.
a normal week.
Yeah.
And then I'll come to you third, Chris.
Okay.
I was basically in bed Tuesday
I have
night
to
and
remember there are
Friday
two
evening.
Chris's on the panel, so
I had a family
direct
party on
which
Saturday.
question goes to which.
Yeah, it's enough.
Very.
Just so you can hear it in my voice.
Yes. Where we go? Start Chris, I'll come to you second for opening remarks, if that's okay.
Perfect.
Great. Well, a hush has descended, so we might start bang on time, which is very exciting. Welcome, thank you so much for coming. My name is Sophia Worringer. I'm the Deputy Policy Director at the Centre for Social Justice, and we are gathered today to discuss one of the biggest challenges facing this country and the future of the country, which is economic inactivity. Those who are economically inactive, they are those who are not in work and they're not seeking work and they're not required to seek work in the immediate future. And there are 9.4 million of those. That's gone up 400,000 over the last year. And in that cohort, 2.8 million are off work for long-term sick. And failure to act on this issue, which is only unfortunately growing, will see the sickness benefit bill rise by over 10 billion in the next 5 years, with a further up to 1.5 billion in lost tax take. So it's a huge issue, but I'm delighted that we have a great panellist here to discuss the very big question, the very best minds to put forward, not just understanding the scale of the problem, which I think from those numbers we can see is a large one, but how to move forward and what solutions we should be seeing from a policy landscape to tackle this problem. So I'd like to just introduce the panel, and then they will have 5 minutes to speak about the biggest problems and solutions that they are seeing from their perspective, and then we'll go straight to questions from the audience, so hopefully we'll leave a good bulk of time for that, so please do have them ready. So introducing the panel, the Right Honourable Mel Stride MP, Shadow Secretary of State for Work and Pensions to my left, and then to his left we have Chris Smyth, the Whitehall editor of The Times. To my right, we have Tim Montgomerie, journalist and broadcaster with Times Radio, and also a founder of the Centre for Social Justice, which we turned 20 this year, and Tim has been there every step of the way. So very grateful
Makes
for
me
your
feel very
support.
old.
Exactly, that's what we're here for. And then on his right, we have Chris Thomas, head of the Commission on Health and Prosperity from the think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research, IPPR. So thank you very much to our panellists for coming. 5 minutes, please, if we could try and stick to, and so we can allow maximum time for questions. Firstly, Mel, over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. I'm glad you defined economic inactivity at the beginning, because there's often a lot of confusion around this. So people that are out of work and they're not looking for work, as opposed to the unemployed who are out of work and are looking for work. I think it's also important to contextualise economic inactivity, where we are in this country compared to where we've been and where we are internationally. And overall, it's not as bad as many people paint it. And I say overall, I'll come to long-term sickness and disability in a moment. We have a lower level of economic inactivity in the UK at the moment than we did in any year under the last Labour government. It's lower than it was in 2010, and it's below the average level in the OECD, across the EU and the G7. But within that, we have this long-term sickness and disability issue, which is the really big problem. And as Sophia has identified, we've had a huge growth in long-term sickness and disability. It's about 700,000 more people in that category since the pandemic. And the cost to the taxpayer is going up ever exponentially. And of course, it's not good for those people, particularly if they are actually capable of doing some work, because we believe as a party that work is really important. Not least for mental health conditions, which is driving a lot of this surge in incapacity benefits, particularly amongst young people. And of course, good for people themselves, that they can be in work as well as for the economy. Now, in terms of what Labour have been looking at, I think it's important this distinction between economic inactivity and unemployment, because they've been talking about doing things in job centres, so bringing the National Career Service into the job centre, for example. But of course, by definition, that is dealing with and reaching out to people who are actually actively looking for work, rather than actually dealing with those who are economically inactive and not doing it. The other suggestion is that a lot of this is being driven by backlogs in the NHS, and we know a lot about, obviously, the extent of those backlogs. But there's been quite a lot of work, not least by the OBR, in their Fiscal Risks and Sustainability report in autumn 2023, that did quite an in-depth study of the correlation between those that are in those backlogs and the propensity to be economically inactive, and the link is actually quite weak. So the question becomes, what do I think, or we think as a party, we should be doing about long-term sickness and disability? And I think there we would basically conceptually divide it into two parts. You've got a stock of people, which is about 3 million people on these benefits. They're not subject to any conditionalities. They're not expected to be looking for work in any form. They're not expected to even be having discussions about potentially being in work. And yet we know that 20% of that group from surveys would actually like to be in employment if they had sufficient support to get a job. And then there's the flow, those people going into that stock, and that's where we brought forward some fundamental reforms around something called the work capability assessment, which is the gateway into those benefits, making it more appropriate for the modern way of working, recognising that people can work from home in a way that they couldn't in the past, and therefore mobility perhaps being less of an issue than it has been in the past, and also looking at something called the substantial risk route through the WCA, which is to do with mental health, and being a little bit more exacting and a bit more clinical in the way in which we assess that, given that when we set up that route through the WCA many years ago, the expectation was that about 1 person in 100 would go through that route. It's ended up being 15 times that number, so we paid quite a lot of attention to that. Those reforms kick in September of this year. Now the saving to the taxpayer will be about 1.3 billion at the end of the forecast period, and it will see over 400,000 more people on that journey into work, and I think that's a really important thing. But you've got to support them, so that's why we have rolled out, or when we were in government, we did something called universal support. That's a year's worth of one-to-one support of the person that's gone into jobs, so not just finding the job, but actually supporting them during their time in employment. And a huge expansion in something called NHS talking therapies, hundreds of thousands more courses to help those who are presenting with mental health conditions. So a huge amount working there. The final thing I would mention is it's important to get as upstream as you can of these kind of issues. Typically somebody who ends up in the stock of about 3 million long-term sick and disabled people may have come out of work, about 400,000 people a year, gone to their GP, got signed off, got a sick note, and then not got the treatment they may have required. So what we're doing is we were doing, sorry, I keep thinking we're still in government, which we're not, are we? Wish we were, perhaps we will be in the future, but anyway. What we were doing was taking the fit notes away from the doctor, who was typically giving the person presented to them 6 minutes on average, and on 94% of occasions signing them off as being totally incapable of doing any work whatsoever under any circumstances, and putting that individual directing in something called Workwell, which is being rolled out in the autumn, which brings together work coaches alongside the appropriate medical support. The final thing I would say, because I'm probably, what am I, 4 minutes, 44 seconds, okay, is PIP, personal independence payments. If you're looking at areas of the welfare budget that are growing exponentially, then PIP would be one of those. If we hold the cohort number of people that have PIP at the current level, in 5 years' time, that will be a saving to the Exchequer of £14 billion, which is a huge amount of money. In the context of all the other demands on the public purse, that is something that I think we probably can't ignore, and we consulted on how we would reform that benefit at the end of our time in office. And I won't go into great detail about that, perhaps that can come out in questions. But the final point I would make is we don't actually know where the current government is on almost any of the issues that I've just covered, whether in favour of the WCA reforms that we brought in, whether they want to scrap them, what they're going to do with the PIP consultation that I've just touched on. So I think a very important moment for all of us is going to be the 30th of October when Rachel Reeves unveils the budget. And to see what she has about welfare and some of the really tough decisions which are now no longer ours, but actually for this Labour government. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mel. And you mentioned there universal support. We were delighted to work with you to get that £1 billion of support to those who are furthest from the labour market over the line.
Yep.
So that was a great success that we can point to just in the last year.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So now we're going to go to Chris Thomas. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I'll try not to duplicate a lot of the great ground that Mel's covered, but I'm going to talk a little bit from the perspective of a big piece of work IPPR have undertaken in the last 3 years called the Commission on Health and Prosperity. It's been an exploration of essentially this issue of health-related economic inactivity, chaired by Lord Aradazi, who some in the room will know as having just done the independent investigation into the NHS, and Dame Sally Davis, who some will know as former Chief Medical Officer for England. But actually involving a lot of different groups, so business groups, charities, labour market economists, lots of people that actually came together to say that they thought health and economic inactivity was one of the defining challenges that the UK faces, and that from different constituencies they could see that as a pressing priority. So a few details to add from what the Commission's research has found that I think give a bit of flavour to what some of our solutions need to be. The first is that sickness is genuinely rising in the UK. It is interesting that it is not just the retired population that are growing sicker in this country. The working age population is much, much more likely to have long-term chronic conditions, multiple conditions, and in fact children and adolescents also more likely to have health conditions of some kind than they have been in recent decades. That's having a profound knock-on impact, obviously, on economic participation on work. I agree, 2.8 million is a substantial amount. We think 4.3 million could be out the labour market by the end of the next 5 years if trends continue, which is just testament that this is a relatively recent rise and it might not have tapped out yet. So the size of this challenge could increase if there isn't action by the current government going forward. So a few contextual points to that I think are worth making. Who are the 2.8 million people currently out the labour market? And there's 3 things that really strike me about that group. The first is they tend to have come from low parts or lower parts of the labour market. So when we look at that group, they're much more likely to come from, say, elementary occupations, from careers like social care where workforce protections are low. They're much more likely to have lower levels of education than others. So this is a group that in any other public service we would think were quite challenging to reach. They're normally underserved communities in other ways. So that's one complexity that we have. Second thing we find about them is that they have really complicated health needs. There is a big difference between someone with health needs that's economically inactive because of health and the general population. So the average number of health conditions that this group have is 3. A very large proportion have 4 or more conditions, so a mental health condition and several physical health conditions, or vice versa. So again, that adds to the complexity of the challenge we're dealing with. And then the last element that's worth pointing out is that this isn't nationally distributed in an equal way. So some parts of the country don't have any challenge with economic inactivity or sickness. When we look at West Oxfordshire, pretty healthy, lots of people in work, lots of economic participation. When we look at Blackpool, Nottingham, and places like it, deindustrialised, more deprived parts of the country, normally quite urban, then the challenge is really, really profound. So what we essentially have are people that often get failed by different services that have very complicated needs and are quite localised around the country, and I think that makes it a really difficult, but that's quite a good set of contextual clues for what the solutions might be. So what does the Commission recommend? Well, I won't go into absolute granularity, but to give a flavour, I think the challenge that we set out is that we still have a very reactive approach to health policy, given that this is a problem defined by sickness. We will wait for those people to come into the NHS, we will treat them for their acute need, and then we'll send them back to wherever they've come from. And that, when you've got people with lots of different chronic conditions, lots of complexity, it's not a very good system. So our proposal was that if we need any shift, it's a shift in health policy from reactivity to proactivity. So a much more proactive approach. And that should be based, to me, on bringing health into the places people actually spend their time. You might spend, a few weeks or a few months over the course of your life in a hospital. But you'll spend 80,000 hours in a workplace, you'll spend 10,000 hours in a school. And yet it's hospitals that we try to do all the health policy from. So what do we do? So I think first we need to bring, some of this is about a flow of good jobs. If we have an unequal distribution of economic inactivity due to sickness, we need to wrestle with the fact that labour markets aren't equal in the country either. Can we bring good jobs to the places where economic inactivity is concentrated? Priority of health services, I agree, clearing the elective backlog, as Mel says, isn't going to solve this problem, but the NHS is disastrously bad at dealing with complexity, complex health needs. So how do we build its capacity to actually do that? Prevention, how do we make sure that the burden of sickness is lower, because that's how you impact the flow of some of this challenge. And there are lots of good, well-evidenced ways to bring prevention much more strongly into our policy, as, to be honest, lots of other countries that are much healthier than the UK have done. That, I think, hopefully gives a flavour. I might be running over slightly, so I'll pause there. But looking forward to the discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Chris. Very good for your thoughts. And what's been great is to see the growing consensus amongst think tanks and research institutions from the left and the right and the centre ground all trying to put their heads together to fix this problem. So it's great to see the IPPR research on this making great strides. Let's go to Chris Smyth next. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. And it is noticeable how much this issue has moved up the political agenda in the last couple of years. I remember when I first started writing about it, less than 2 years ago, economic activity was seen as a slightly jokey issue about over 50s playing golf too much and how they needed to sort of maybe do a bit of work. And the fact that the primary challenge is about long-term sickness, I think, has come through now, and there is a cross-party consensus. I mean, Mel embraced this when he was in government, and I think new Labour government have embraced that too. This is an absolutely fundamental challenge, both to our economy and to our public finances. But I actually do think there is further to go in understanding the scale of the problem. I mean, I don't know how many of you read the OBR's Economic and Fiscal Risks report of the week, but it's the wonkish audience, I can ask that question. It is terrifying. I mean, it says the health of Britain is the single biggest risk to public finances in the decade ahead. And if you look at their projections, where the current trend of worsening health and against the baseline, and the trend of improving health against the baseline, the swing between those things is 8% of GDP over the next few decades. At current prices, that's £200 billion, bigger than the entire budget of the NHS. This is absolutely fundamental. If we don't get this right, we are going to be in a mess. So what do we do about it? And the distinction I'd make is the short term and the long term. Because when it comes to longer term things, I think there are lots of good ideas out there, and there's a fair degree of consensus. Both parties talking about breaking down this binary distinction between fit for work and not fit for work, and trying to make it more flexible so that people who have long-term sickness can try employment and not get scared of losing their benefits, and encouraging them back to work. Both sides now talk about occupational health support, getting employers to do more and finding ways to keep people in work and stop them dropping out. And both sides talk about personalised help for the long-term sick as crucial in terms of getting them closer to the workforce and ready for jobs. Now, there are differences in emphasis. I mean, Mel talks about universal support a lot. Liz Kendall talks about joining up the NHS and job centres. But I think there is a solid group of propositions there that the people can probably unite behind. And then I suppose in the even longer term, there's what, if I was at Labour conference last week, they would call the sort of social determinants of health. I think here we would call the condition of the nation or something like that. The fact that sickness does track with all these other things about lack of opportunity, education, other deprivation, and if you deal with some of this problem will be dealt with. But that is an even longer term. And I remember, this time last year, Mel, saying you need to have patience. The key thing with welfare reform is that it takes time. You could rush it. Universal credit started 10 years ago. We're still not finished. So this program work is a decade or more. But the problem really is short-term and increasingly acute. I mean, the financial pressures have grown. By the end of the Parliament, this government will find spending on incapacity and disability benefits 30 billion higher than before the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And they're going to need to do something about that. Voters are not going to tolerate an ever-growing proportion of their taxes going to this area when they are crying out for spending in other areas. And at the moment, I don't think there is a good short-term answer to how we control, that cost. Mel started some things on, the work capability assessment, PIP talking about mental health and how we conceptualise that in society. The current government has sort of backed away from all of those. I mean, I think they'll end up doing the work capability assessment because they don't want to find the money, but they certainly don't want to talk about it. So I do think, we do need to work out actually what we're willing to accept in the short term and what we're not willing to accept. I mean, the government has flirted with Alan Milburn's interesting ideas on imposing conditionality on this benefits, but even there they are being a little bit cautious and they don't want to go there just yet. So there is this gap which, if they are not careful, will be filled by some quite angry people saying that we need to sort of tear down the welfare system in its entirety. And Labour's usual answer to all of these questions is, well, economic growth will solve all these problems of public spending. The issue here is that to get economic growth, you need to get people back to work and deal with it. So they can't rely on that answer. And I think it's a bit of a gloomy note to end on. So what we say is the value of events like this and discussions like this, with perhaps less political heating, is that perhaps people come forward with some ideas to actually how we manage that transition in the short term to a longer term vision of a better welfare system, get the political buy-in to ensure that it is prioritised. And I think here the spending review next year is probably more important than the budget in terms of the long-term funding to do some of these things, and how we sort of buy ourselves the space to make that happen without undermining public support in the short term.
Brilliant, thank you. Thank you, Chris, and I'm very glad that somebody wades through the ABR tome, so we don't have to. So thanks for taking that for the team. Brilliant. Well, we're going to go now to Tim Montgomerie. Thank you, Tim.
Well, I thought I was chairing today's meeting, so I haven't prepared anything at all. So if you're going to forgive me, and I will try and say this without being too emotional, I'm going to talk a little bit about my own recent story, which I think talks quite a bit to what Mel said about the importance of universal support and having someone in your corner. For those who don't know, before really for the last sort of 5 years, I was someone who was probably would sort of think of myself as a self-starting, didn't need anyone else kind of Tory, whether it was Conservative Home or Unheard or this organisation. I was able to set things up and didn't really need anyone else in my corner. And then lockdown struck, and I really went through some of the most darkest periods of my life. I live on my own, and life was incredibly hard. I really did not know how sometimes I was going to survive that day. I really went into some of the darkest recesses I could imagine. And it's taken me a long time to get back to what I would call normal life. And I look back at how I've got there, and one of the people who's not in this room, but certainly there is Andy Cook, who runs this organisation. Another, I can say this in front of Chris, is Rebecca Brooks, who runs News UK. Another is definitely my parents, my mum and dad. And I have hugely benefited from the fact that I've had people in my corner, people who love me, people who've known that I had that sort of track record of success before I hit difficulties where I was basically useless for weeks and months on end, who knew that if they gave me time and patience and support, I could come back, could bounce back. And I think I'm nearly there. I'm not fully there, but I still have times when I sort of don't function as I have in the past. But my great fortune is, I think lots of people have reverses in their life. My great fortune was that it occurred to me at a stage in my life where I had that social infrastructure around me, either organically through my family or because I built it up over a working career. I had those people who could help me get back on track. And I think that really is the importance of universal support, because so many people do not have that. So many people who fail in life just do not have those people who help them get back up off the floor and support them. And I think as we go forward, the investment in that facility, that programme, and it's not something Conservatives automatically perhaps think is necessary. We are, I think, a self-starting creed. We believe in, people can achieve anything. If they start from nothing, you can work your way to the top. But most of us actually don't do life on our own. We always need other people. And I think the challenge as we go forward is how much of universal support should be provided by the state and how much it should be provided by a range of voluntary organisations. What other sort of network of groups, including actually the extended family, do we need to think about what universal support means? So I don't think you can divorce a lot of these questions about how we support people from something, for example, like housing policy. So many people live so far apart now from people who love them and know them that you can be anonymous. And so, in a way, universal support is a specific program, but what does it mean as an idea? What does it mean about surrounding people with networks of care, networks of restarting that we all need? And so my challenge, Mel, as we go forward as a party to think about these things, is what does universal support mean? Because certainly from my experience, getting back into the groove, getting back into where you need to be, is a much more complicated and not linear process. You have advances and then you have setbacks, and coping with that, tolerating that, knowing that people's journeys aren't linear is an incredibly important part of understanding it, and creating the infrastructure around that really matters.
Thank you so much, Tim, and thank you for helping us remember that behind every number that we have there is a story, and embodying that for us. I think that is really important, that these are lives, that not just statistics and graphs. So I'm going to go straight to questions from the floor. We'll take 2 at a time, and then panellists can respond to the pair of questions as they would like to. So can we have one at the front here, and then also second at the front here? Please do wait for the mic. No microphone. Please just speak up and say where you're from, so we can have a bit of background. Thank you.
So Jo Campion from Endometriosis UK, a condition which affects 1 in 10 women, a menstrual health condition. 1 in 6 women leave work because of this condition, and my question for Hannah is to look at what the responsibilities are for the employer in this situation. We know that flexible working rights are particularly important to these women, that they've often been forced out of the workplace when those requests have been made. We often get contacted by people who have been unfairly penalised by automated HR absence systems, which penalise people that need short 2 days off, but cyclical time off work. Given that this affects such a large number of the population, and women being half the population, what can we do to ensure that these flexible working rights in the Employment Rights Bill are supported by all parties, because this is really important, but also that menstrual health conditions are covered for, workers' rights for menstrual health conditions are extended to all and not just those with menopause.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, and thank you.
Hello, I'm Caroline Abrahams from Age UK, and I think we know that quite a significant proportion of people aged 50 to 67 are economically inactive, and I wondered if the panel had any specific thoughts about what we need to do to support older workers in staying in work and then getting back into the labour market if they've been detached. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris Thomas, can I come to you on the first question about the kind of complexities of different challenges of health concerns, and then come to Mel on the employment rights kind of side of that question?
Yeah, really important point. And in fact, our analysis of this issue shows a big gender inequality, which in the flip side is an opportunity. We also found that if we could solve some of that inequality, then we make progress on big issues like gender pay gaps and other kind of differentials in society. I think your point on how to get employers involved in this is a really good one. I think basically, for a long time, our standards for health and safety have been very safety-led. So we have the health and safety executive, but not really a health and safety executive. They're a safety executive. And so we haven't really brought health into the workplace in a way that we might have a 21st century understanding of it. It's still kind of very injury-led rather than health-creating. So what can we do about that? I think there are a couple of things that we probably need. The first is data. How we monitor some of this is quite difficult. So there is a data creation challenge, but there are lots of people that are doing lots of good work on workplace health monitoring. So there is a basis that we could move forward with. I think a sense of standards. There are lots of places, Scotland, Manchester, that have tried things like good work charters, good employment charters. Bringing health more explicitly into that kind of approach, I think, has great promise. It sets a base of aspiration, and it could include some of the things that you've talked about. And then I think incentive and regulation are the two kind of levers that we have available to us. So I was very taken by the success of some of the trials of a wellbeing premium in the West Midlands. That was an incentive payment to get employers to care about health and to define it and to take commitments to improve it. But there is also a regulatory part of this. So I think in the case of flexibility, we know a great many people economically inactive because of sickness will only be able to go back into a job that offers flexible working. So if jobs don't offer flexible working, it's not a job that can be filled by someone in that position. Some of those core standards I think there's a regulatory case for. So a mix.
Great, thank you. Mel, the politics of the Employment Rights Bill, your thoughts?
So I think this is all about balance between businesses that are often struggling with all sorts of challenges and feel that they're swimming against a tide of ever-increasing taxation and red tape and employee rights and so on and so forth, with the kind of issues that you've so eloquently expressed around flexible working. So the new legislation, as I understand it, is likely to be having a presumption of flexible working from day one, and also the ability to go to an employment tribunal if there is a sense that any discrimination has occurred. So I'm slightly uncomfortable about that, I have to say, and I know that may not be the answer that you're looking for, but I think it's important that when we consider the bill, we really look at that balance between worker rights on the one hand and, are we moving towards more of a French-based model of industrial relations that may follow from much of the direction this government is taking us, which is characterised, as we know, by lots of strikes and lots of warring between employers and employees. But, flexible working clearly has a very important role, exactly in the way that you described it. If I could, can I just talk about the over 50s? Yeah. Just very quickly. So I think we did a lot of work around midlife MOTs, actually, because if you get older people, often one of the calculations they've made is that they're going to live for a certain period of time, but not so long that they're not going to be able to afford to have a good quality of living throughout that period. And sometimes that is simply not the case. So it's a case of sitting down with people and explaining that it would be probably in their interest to work longer. There are some employers, and we've encouraged many when we were in government, to do the right kind of things for older workers. B&Q, Aviva Insurance, there are many fine examples of those that have the kind of flexible arrangements in place to accommodate that. And we did various stuff around pensions, actually, and the lifetime allowance, for example, to make sure that particularly those in the NHS who might otherwise retire actually see it in their financial interest to stay on. But it is one of the most important of the big economic inactivity cohorts, along incidentally with students. So when we say there are over 9 million people that are economically inactive, about 2.2 million of them are actually students. So getting back to my earlier point about how big is this problem, probably most of us would expect students to be studying rather than working all the time. So be careful of the statistics, I mean. So.
I think employers are changing in there as time goes by as well. I think their knowledge of who the kind of person they should employ is changing as well. And just a really sort of specific example, we've seen, I don't know what people think about self-service checkouts in supermarkets, but I think they don't pay for themselves because they're easy to shoplift from. Not that I'm speaking from personal experience. But also, my mum used to work in Sainsbury's on the checkouts, and people, she was a brilliant, checkout person. She, people used to queue up because she used to talk to them. And supermarkets have begun to realise that actually a lot of the conversation of older people with other shoppers is incredibly important for loyalty to, and I think what we partly need to do is need to encourage employers to measure things, or at least try and understand things which previously they haven't measured. And when you have an older population, actually that connection with an older workforce is actually quite valuable in lots of respects. And I think supermarkets are beginning to realise that, and that one very specific example, which I have some limited understanding of, given that I know the Tesco manager in Salisbury very well. Sainsbury's, get my Sainsbury's mother up. But I think there must be so many other examples like that. And so I think it's limited what government can do about that, but I think encouraging employers to think about that sort of practice and that sort of hard to measure benefit is a good start.
Chris, Smyth.
Yeah, well, it is striking how absent the role of employers has been from this, conversation politically. I mean, given it is essential in terms of stopping people dropping out of the workforce to look at their working conditions and what are the obstacles and problems there. And I think partly of that is cultural in terms of flexibility, but also in terms of non-traditional career structures and how people can change careers or work differently as they get older. But also there is going to be a political choice to make on what we expect of them, and you could easily see a sort of package of sticks and carrots there. I mean, the last government talked about tax breaks for occupational health schemes. It never quite got off the ground. Other countries, like if you look at what they do in the Netherlands, employers, I think, are on the hook for the first 2 years of sickness benefits if someone drops out. So unsurprisingly, they make a pretty strong effort to make sure they keep their employees well enough. So, but the current government doesn't really want to go down that route while it is having this battle with business over its other employment rights reforms. But I think, having a discussion about what we can expect from business, how we help them, and what burdens you are willing to impose on them to deal with this problem is probably overdue.
Brilliant. 2 more questions. Let's have on the right, that, and on the front row as well. Pays off coming early and being on the front row. I can tell you get the first question. So yes, the lady first. Thank you.
I'm a Surrey County Council and Borough Councillor and chair the Adults and Health Select Committee for 4 years and then chair the Health and Wellbeing Board. And I'm staggered at the whatever seemed to come through when I asked the question what proportion of these people are neurodiverse. It was extremely high. Employment of neurodiversity is extremely low. And the likelihood of someone who's neurodiverse having severe mental health issues because of the lack of opportunities that come their way is high, and their health outcomes as a result, often 20-year life expectancy and the last 20 years with quite a lot of comorbidities. This is a huge, staggeringly huge number. And to me there are 2 things that, one, the way we bring on people who are neurodiverse in the education system. There is almost no funding for prevention and early intervention in that sector. I did a focus group many times, and every single time their main goal was to be the opportunity of a taxpayer, would you believe? And employers, it's not complicated to employ. It's a median curve with neurodiversity, but there's like half of that neurodiversity is eminently employable, and often are the inventors of the things that create opportunities. So what are we going to do about the early life, and how can we persuade employers that it is really easy to employ people with neurodiversity, and they hate change, so they're loyal and they'll stay? Because I think this would knock huge numbers of cost. The other thing is substance abuse, all sorts of other things follow, and also very high propensity people without opportunities end up in the judicial system.
Great, thank you very much. A gentleman as well, thank you.
I'm disabled, and just following on from what Mel said about PIP, and the other thing I was wondering is access to work. PIP is actually a very good thing, because for the first time ever, you're being assessed by a professional. It will actually save money in the sense that you're assessed by the professional. You don't do it yourself. But the guidance from DWP still said sum it out for your worst case scenario. Does that make sense? So that is a good thing. But the other thing is access to work. That needs, with all due respect to you, that needs streamlining. Access to work. It is very difficult to apply for access to work. And a lot of people who are long-term unemployed are disabled in receipts, UC and or UC, and the biggest problem they've got is getting an access to work. And if I'm an employer and someone says I need time to get an access to work, I'm going to think, well, no, that's going to cost me too much time. So I can see it from that point of view. But does the panel agree that access to work needs streamlining? Do you guys done any research?
Does the panel agree? Mel, would you like to?
Well, there's certainly a big backlog, which we were beginning to get down. I can't remember the figures down, but it was unacceptably high, and it's now not my problem, it's somebody else's, thankfully. I mean, it is a very expensive benefit. I can't remember what the upper level is. It's about 80-odd thousand for an individual.
Yeah, it is.
So it's a big commitment. On PIP, I think it's a really important benefit. Absolutely, we should be providing that kind of benefit. It is a very blunt benefit in the sense that whilst it is tiered and the amounts available vary depending on the circumstances, it's also the case that, you know, if you were in a situation where you needed a grab rail to get into the bath or something, that was basically the requirement. You could be on the lower level of PIP, and you could be on thousands of pounds a year, and it could go on for several years, and you might actually be getting the grab rail from your local NHS or the local authority and so on. Whereas there might be somebody else who's more deserving than the high level of PIP, which is about 9k a year. So I think this idea of targeting and having benefits that are fit for purpose and really focus on need is really important. And a failure to do that is always going to cost somebody somewhere else in the system. And I think that's the point. And so I think to the very valid points that you were making about neurodiversity and the help and the assistance that's needed there requires undoubtedly more resource in that area. But the reality is, if you're operating a very blunt instrument like PIP, the cost of which is likely to escalate by probably about 12 billion, I think, over the next 5 years, a huge amount of money. If that's being misallocated in terms of doing good for that money and it's better used elsewhere, that's one of the major imperatives of welfare reform, is to get that targeting right so that the limited resource can go around in the best possible way. And that means tough, as Chris said, longer term decisions. Why? Because often millions of people are affected. It's quite right that we very carefully consult on all those measures. We will be resisted by stakeholders and others, lots of other people that have opinions on these things and want things to stay where they are or move in the other direction. And because of judicial reviews and challenges and all the rest of it, these things take a long, long time to push through, and you need compassion, time and determination. But at the heart of it, you just have to believe that you've got a certain resource and you've got to ruthlessly focus it on where the need is needed most. And that's my concern with PIP, is I think it's too blunt. I could talk about it for a long time, but I think it's probably enough.
Great. Chris Thomas.
So great questions. I wanted to come back on the neurodiversity point, because I think you're absolutely right that the representation in both health inequality data and economic inactivity data is stark. I think there's a few things that we can think about. I think you're right that, I mean, part of our argument of bringing health into places that aren't just hospitals is thinking about things like schools and work, which is where you'll spend a vast majority of time during life. But schools at the moment are facing a challenge in just capability to meet need. So there's a massive differential between what schools can actually meet and what need exists amongst children, and that need is growing. So there's a big immediate challenge. But two other things that I think are important. I mean, IPS, or individual placement support, has a very, very good track record for this, including kind of top tier control trials behind it. So I think we could do more with that. The challenge I would make is one to the NHS, because one of the things that I found slightly hard to work out in the last couple of years is that we have this coexisting challenge of the NHS saying that it has one of the most alarming labour shortages of any public service, and we have a big cohort of people who are out of the labour market because of sickness. And we thought twinning those two things, given the NHS is a massive employer that is well distributed across the country, would be a really good thing to do. Now, the big opportunity here for me is that where the NHS has grasped individual placement support, places like Northampton, it's worked incredibly well. They've integrated that approach within NHS employment, and they've created lots of employment opportunities, good for the NHS, good for employment statistics. Scaling that across the country would be a massive lever. It's just one lever, but I think one that could hold a lot of promise. Again, in the context of the NHS having a long-term workforce plan that is very expensive and will need to justify itself on social value as well as anything else.
Great. For the interest of time, we won't go to all the panellists for every question, so we'll go to two more questions. Let's have the gentleman in the second row and then the lady with the black and top. Thank you.
John Campion, I'm the West Mercia Police and Crime Commissioner. I'm interested in what you see as the role of the criminal justice system in bringing those who are currently economically inactive. Now, it's a slightly slanted question, because despite people perhaps stealing things through the self-checkout in the local Tesco's, there is a whole bunch of money spent by policing and criminal justice system dealing with harm, often generational individuals who haven't broken that cycle. But how then, where they're causing economic harm, shifting towards the criminal justice system, supporting those people being economically active and contributing to the economy?
Do you have your own answer to that question?
I do.
Sounds like that's great. Thank you. And then the lady there.
Hi, Sarah Ronan from the Early Education and Childcare Coalition. In March 23, we obviously had a budget that was centred around the expansion of the 30-hour offer to working parents for subsidised childcare, often called free childcare, spoiler. intervention, we also had a number of other measures around universal credit. The subsequent analysis of that policy by the Institute for Fiscal Studies found that the third poorest families get no direct benefit from that 30-hour offer, and actually 5/6 of total spend simply represents a transfer of payment from parents that would have paid for childcare already, predominantly higher and middle income earners, to the state. And so my question for the panel is that if we're going to use childcare as a lever to tackle economic inactivity, do we need to consider a reform of that model to make sure that subsidised childcare is targeted at the families that need it the most?
Brilliant, thank you very much. Chris Smyth, would you like to come in on either of those?
Well, I mean, I'm going to slightly dodge the question on childcare because I don't know enough about the system to know how to reform it. But I do think it does illustrate the importance of being precise when we're talking about economic activity, and because traditionally a lot of that has been people, predominantly women, out of the workforce looking after their children. I think one of the reasons why this problem has slightly snuck up on us is because the decline in that over the last generation, as more women work, which most people would probably think is a good thing, has largely masked the increase in long-term sickness because the headline numbers, haven't gone up, and as Mel said, they're lower than they were in the past. But a lot of that is because the numbers who are looking after the family is much, much lower than it was, while the numbers who are off work sick, it has increased, a lot. So in terms of the composition of inactivity, that does matter, and we should be thinking primarily about what type of inactivity we are fine with and what we actually want to discourage, and probably that does mean focusing more on sickness.
Brilliant. Tim Montgomerie.
Just on childcare, I don't think you can really interpret childcare policy out of the context of almost every other policy there is. I talked earlier about housing policy. So much childcare is provided informally amongst families, and it's completely unrecognised at the moment by the state. So if you pay for other people outside of your family to look after the children, the state recognises you. If you use your gran to care for your kids, or your children's gran to care for your kids, then there's often no recognition. And so one thing the Centre for Social Justice has done a lot of work on is actually sort of almost communitarising the money, so that families themselves can take pockets of money that at the moment very specifically allocated to certain ways of using the money, and allowing families to choose how to spend that money themselves. Now that goes completely against the current policy, and so the trouble with the policy is there would be many losers in it. But actually I think it would take us to a better place overall. But I think you'd almost have to sort of grandfather the policy in some way, because so many people have arrangements now which completely depend upon existing childcare policies. So you'd almost have to sort of have a cut-off whereby new arrangements could follow that path that the CSJ has recommended. But I think it would be hard to take it away from people who've now got their existing childcare arrangements through their employers or through a formal private provided network.
Could I just come back on one thing?
Very quickly, only.
On that is that I think part of the problem with this is that we do just treat childcare in terms of parental employment in the here and now.
Yeah.
We don't look at the future proofing that exists within early education childcare anyway. For example, that poorest third of families, all the evidence shows that access to high quality early education for those poorest children means that they're more likely to go on to become higher earners, have higher rates of employment.
You said it was a question,
Yeah, so my point is that we shouldn't just treat it in terms of parental employment in the here and now. It should be about future proofing as well.
I agree.
Okay, great, thank you. We're going to go to a few more questions. Maybe we'll take 3 now, because I want to give the panellists a chance to do concluding remarks, and we'll give them just a heads up on what I'd love to hear from them. All the panellists, your one policy solution to tackle economic inactivity and get Britain back to work after we've taken 3 questions. So, from the back, can we have the lady in the cream jacket? Yes, perfect. And then the gentleman there, and then the lady in the orange jacket. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Kiri. I work at Christian Kids Policy and one of the services that we offer is Job Clubs. And Tim, I was really struck by what you said about what happened in COVID and how you had some wraparound care from people around you, and that's how our model works. We work in community to help people into work with our job clubs. And one of my questions really is, knowing that many of the
to apply and to get into work. And what more could the government do, or why is there not more investment in that one-on-one community support to help people into work?
Brilliant, thank you very much. And yes, gentleman in the back.
Richard Short, I'm an environmental health practitioner. I'm interested in Chris Thomas because he's mentioned a few times how by the time primary care healthcare comes in, it's too late. So it's just a quick question for the panel, is there a place here to extend the reach into public health and environmental health to sort of go more upstream to positive health?
Brilliant, thank you, lady in the orange.
Hi, I'm Marianne Stevenson from the Women's Budget Group. I wanted to follow up on the point about economic inactivity among older people, 15 to 60-year-olds, and you get a particular increase there among older women. And I actually think if you look at what's going on there, it slightly challenges the OBR notion that waiting lists aren't a problem in terms of economic inactivity, because waiting lists don't just cause the people who are on the waiting list to not be able to work. They often mean that other people are having to stop work to look after them. So, I am aware of, several women in their 50s who have to give up work either because a parent is on the waiting list and they need more intensive care than they would have, say if they've had a hip replacement, or a teenage child is on a CAMS waiting list, and anybody who's had any dealings with CAMS knows how appallingly long the waiting list. You have a child who is not going into school, has suicidal ideation, cannot be left on their own, and that mother's had to give up work. And in both of those cases, they wouldn't be picked up by the OBR modelling, which is people on a waiting list who are economically inactive, but people are on an economic. So I'm just wondering if it's worth re-looking at that issue about NHS waiting lists.
Great, so 3 questions. One-to-one support, how do we increase confidence and increase resources to one-to-one support? Extending public health to go upstream to look at root causes and the particular challenges of cohorts of older people, particularly women, who maybe are being held back by the waiting lists. Over to you, panel. Who would like to go first? Chris Thomas, go on.
Brilliant questions. I want to briefly just come back on all 3. So on the question of one-to-one support, I thought the really interesting part of how you framed that was why don't we invest more in it? And I think the way that we make investments is probably one of those reasons. So one of the things we've talked about a lot, given that there is a huge evidence base behind some of these things, is how do we get some form of awareness or methodology for health into the OBR forecast so that essentially they can be integrated into the 5-year forecast they do at fiscal events, and in turn you can get methodologies that would essentially discount health investment, which the last government began. The investment in mental health that came in, I think it was the 23 budget, had that kind of basis running through it. So that's a really interesting start to that process. Public health, I think that's where a lot of the gains lie. So the base level of health in the population, I think, will be vitally important to how much public services cost. I mean, our analysis suggested if you have healthy life expectancy growing, then your benefits bill goes down as a country, but also the NHS gets less expensive in terms of what real-term increase it needs and that cost slope that it always has. So I think that's a massively important starting point, and public health is inevitably going to be the earliest and best and most cost-effective way to intervene. And then the point on the waiting list, I think this is really interesting because I think the OBR figures on waiting lists come up a lot, but the methodology for it is based on a hell of a lot of assumptions about historical trends holding true. And there is later, I think, quite interesting analysis, and this is just indication. It goes to show that I think we're in the space of debate, not conclusion. The NHS doesn't matter here, which is that in this moment, the crisis the NHS facing is so acute that actually waiting lists are much more important in economic inactivity than we would historically have assumed. So I think there's still an open book on that one. The OBR analysis is interesting, but it's not the final word on what's going on, I don't think.
Brilliant. Mel?
Yeah, and I think there's a really, really interesting point you made about the impact of waiting lists on economic inactivity in the OBR's analysis, and you've sort of whetted my appetite to dive back into their fiscal report and have another look there. And I think it's what the OBR would call sort of second round effects of, are there behavioural consequences for those who are not directly impacted by this particular issue and the effect on employment. So I will actually have a little look about that. On long-term unemployment, absolutely, support is key. This is where universal support is the big game changer that we brought in now, 100,000 people that's available to. I don't know where that will go. That's for the current government to decide. What I would say, though, just to put in a sort of rather tougher note to this, because I think there should be an element of toughness in the welfare system as well, for the reasons I've described of targeting the resources that we have to those that need it most, and also to be fair to the taxpayer, because at the end of the day, if you're going to have a welfare system that's alive and whole, it's got to command the respect and confidence of the taxpayer as well. And that is where, if somebody is capable of working, has been out of work for a period of 12 months, is offered a job that is a perfectly good and decent job to have, but chooses to say, actually, no, I'd rather actually stay on benefits than take that job that I'm very capable of doing, okay, so it's not somebody that needs further support, then I think it's right that under those circumstances benefits are removed. So I think that within any proper, sensible welfare system, there has to be a lot of love and a lot of support and a lot of targeting and a lot of the kind of things that we spend billions of pounds on. And it's absolutely right that we do that as a civilised society. But we must not be sort of emotionally pushed into a space where we're not prepared to say, actually, for some, look, we've given you everything we've got, you've been out of work for a year, you are capable of working, there are no reasons why you shouldn't, you have a job in front of you, you're just choosing not to work, and there should be consequences for that. Final thing I would say is absolutely upstreaming. Whoever made the point about that is absolutely critical. I mentioned in my opening remarks about work well, and rather than people just going to the GP and getting signed off and then not getting the treatment they want, getting people upstream is absolutely critical. Occupational health is certainly part of that. Chris mentioned that we, as when we were in government, had consulted on that, both the Treasury and DWP had, both in terms of creating a more ready available, accessible marketplace for occupational health for employers, and also tax incentives for employers to actually engage in that way. So I think this upstreaming is absolutely key. If you can hold people in the workforce rather than falling out, or bring them into the workforce when they're close to the workforce, you save an absolute fortune in terms of human happiness and all the rest of it further down the line, rather than people drifting into longer term sickness benefits.
Brilliant. Okay, so we're going to go down the panel, starting with Chris. 1 minute. What is your policy solution to fix this problem?
Well, I mean, I'm going to slightly dodge the question by saying you can't fix this problem with one policy solution, which is why it is so difficult. You do actually need, I mean, not only every part of government to take it seriously and try and work out how we improve the nation's health, but also a wider cultural shift in terms of what we think is normal in how we live our lives, in terms of what we eat, how we move, we live, what we sort of look at social media and it's mental health. But this is something that is not going to be solved unless that that kind of change happens across society, which is one reason why it is good that this is becoming such a hot topic of debate, because that becomes more likely. And the danger is if you try and solve it with one or two tweaks, they tend to backfire. I mean, we talked about PIP. Obviously, PIP was introduced 10 years ago as a way of controlling costs, essentially, because people thought the last system was too expensive, and it is now tens of billions of pounds a year more expensive than the last system. So if you try and just crack down on one element, you will probably find the pressure cropping up again elsewhere. And I mean, I suppose I want to just end on the political point, which goes back to the point about things like one-to-one support, public health, all that prevention effort. Traditionally, governments have not wanted to spend money on these kind of things because you spend the money now, but the benefits to the wider public only appear many years later, and things like the acute pressure in the NHS, which is always there, have tended to take priority. I think we are now at a moment with this new government where it is an early term, it's got a massive majority, and its rhetoric is all about prevention and long-term decisions, where we're going to see if that is actually possible at all in the system that we have, to say, oh no, we are going to take money away from the immediate term and spend it on things that only pay back further down the line. And there was also a question for the Conservatives there, if they do some of this by changes to the way they count their fiscal rules and what they count as investment spending and what they're going to borrow there, how do you respond to that? Is it all about saying you're fiddling the books, which probably is a fair criticism to some of it, and how much you say yes, we are willing to say actually this category of spending we do need to find a way of funding it?
Brilliant, thanks. Let's keep them short to finish in time.
Right,
now.
okay. Well, I would carry on doing what I was doing when I was in government, of course. So firstly, they've got to stick to the work capability assessment reforms. If they row back on that, I'm afraid the battle is lost, ladies and gentlemen. So we watch this space. But I think, as Chris has suggested, the OBR have already baked those savings in a fiscal sense at 3 billion, I think, at the end of the scorecard. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for Rachel Reeves to sit there and say, oh, well, we'll scrap that for that reason alone. But I think it's the right thing to do, you know, in terms of good policy. We need to invest more in universal support. We need to make sure we get that one-to-one support to people, and that means being able to fund it within existing constraints. So I think the work that we were doing on PIP is really important. I think if there are savings to be made there, they could be put into much more productive areas like universal support and the kind of upstreaming measures that we've discussed. I was going to go on to fiscal rules and things, but I'll stop there.
No time for fiscal rules. Thank you, Tim.
I'm tempted to say my single policy would put Mel back into office.
Because thank you. Very sensible. Thank you.
He is so good, and Mel, while I'm being personal, you were brilliant as a leadership candidate, by the way. You really were, and lots of us hope you still have a big role in whatever is future. But I'm just going to go back to where I began, really. For me, that investment in universal support is absolutely critical. It's something the CSJ always thought when we first argued for universal credit. We thought there needed to be that universal support policy alongside it, because some people aren't easy self-starters. They don't automatically respond to incentives. And so I think it's had some early successes as a policy, but I think it's still, I think when we first envisaged it, we envisaged it needing an awful lot more of a bigger budget. So I think it's a good policy that still needs to be properly funded.
Brilliant, Chris.
Very quickly from me, I entirely agree with Chris's point that there isn't a silver bullet to this issue. It's about how you get government departments to work together. That's not a particularly sexy kind of policy agenda, but it's the key to it, is that mechanics of how we get everyone to care. How do you do that? I think the only real infrastructure that's worked to get government working together on a big long-term goal, and it will have to be long-term as a project, is climate change. They've got net zero, big infrastructure, big target, climate change committee, carbon budgets, a whole infrastructure about making government work together, increasing the pain for inaction, and getting things to happen. I'd like to see similar on health, to make it long-term, to make it work together.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming. This evening we have our social justice hustings, 8 p.m. in the Thatcher Theatre over in the ICC. All 4 leadership contenders will be setting out their stall about what they will do to tackle social justice, and audience questions will be taken. Please do come along to that. Thank you to our panellists. Thank you for coming, and enjoy the rest of your day. Well, I was watching the clock.
Well done.
Good.